Hello, my dears. So recently I've been seeing more and more articles of women who are in their 50s and 60s writing about how feminism or their feminist beliefs have negatively impacted their love lives. They write about experiencing a loneliness that they didn't fully anticipate when they were younger. And today we're going to be looking at 3 different women who shared their stories and discussed this because I think it could be quite interesting, and I definitely think their stories serve as cautionary tales for women who also want to have families but maybe are trying really hard to apply a feminist way of doing things, or trying to apply some of the feminist beliefs in the way that they try to conduct their relationships. So the first article is titled, "I Regret Belittling Men. At 63, I've Ended Up Alone," by Kate Mulvey. So within the article, Mulvey basically reflects that at 63, she feels as though she, quote, paid a hefty price for so-called liberation. She discusses how she came to the realization that her feminist beliefs may have contributed to her being single at this age, as she writes, quote, "I'm convinced feminism has ruined my love life." As a teenager, she was introduced to the women's liberation movement through listening to feminist mantras from figures like Germaine Greer and Betty Friedan, whom she says taught her to act like a man and demonize housework and the family. By her mid-20s, she had very strong academic credentials, and she says she was, quote, "keen to flex her intellectual muscles and to never let the man get the last word." She also admits that she was very competitive within her relationships, with some of the men describing her as intimidating, scary, and opinionated. She also talks about how she treated a lot of conversations with men as like sparring matches, saying, quote, "I was treating every encounter with a man like he was my adversary." And she also admits that a lot of this was because she was scared of vulnerability, as she states, quote, "I longed to be loved, but I also was too scared to be vulnerable. I was using my sharp mind to protect my all too soft heart against rejection." Within her article, she also recalls on past experiences that she had within her relationships and how she now sees why she was wrong to do some of the things that she did. For example, she recalls going on holiday with an ex-boyfriend. They went to Italy together, and she started speaking in Italian to the waiter. She states that she was oblivious to how she must have made her boyfriend at the time feel, as he was essentially just watching her having a full-blown conversation with this Italian waiter in the language that he didn't understand. And now looking back on it, she says she realizes that she was actually just showing off, and in the process of doing that, she was making him feel very small. She also acknowledges how in past relationships or past romantic encounters, she was also very dismissive of kindness, recalling one particular incident where a man gifted her flowers and she criticized him rather than accepting the kind gesture. Then when it comes to the sexual revolution movement, she also acknowledges the fact that she regrets the views that she had at the time about casual sex, saying that she had many one-night stands in her youth, but they often left her feeling very empty and used. And now looking back, she feels as though we very much devalued things like intimacy, connection, and all of these things when it comes to sex, and she thinks that that was not the best choice for us to do. Despite having a very successful career, she says that she's never been married, never had children, and the longest relationship she's ever had lasted 8 years. And she very much believes that her loneliness was partly as a result of the attitudes that she had in her youth. But now she says she's learned to take a step back and now understands that it's also okay to let the men in your life also shine. She does clarify though and say that it's not about dumbing yourself down or becoming a giggly male pleaser, as she says, but more so about just understanding the importance of balance. Then she ends her article with an invitation saying her diary is wide open. Go on, I dare you. Then the second article we're going to discuss is titled, "How Feminism Effed Up My Love Life" by Lori Gottlieb. Now, Gottlieb starts her article with a very provocative assertion that feminism completely effed up her love life. But she does clarify and say, "It's not feminism exactly, but what I consider to be a feminist way of doing things certainly didn't help." She says that her main problem is not necessarily feminism as a whole, but the distorted version of feminism that encourages women that they can have it all. The reason being is because she feels like it encourages women that they should be able to have everything in all areas, in relationships, in their careers, etc. It doesn't really allow them to have a realistic expectation in terms of what they are able to have in their lives. She continues on to say that her generation were taught that in order to be empowered, they had to never compromise, stating, quote, "We grew up believing that we could have it all. Not compromising meant having high standards. The higher our standards, the more empowered we were. And she argues that this belief is what causes a lot of women, or a lot of women within her generation, to reject perfectly good partners, saying, quote, "In real life, you can't get everything you want, when you want it, on your terms only." And this view caused a lot of them to view dating as searching or hunting or shopping rather for the perfect partner, and looking at men as a package deal rather than as really human beings with their own individual flaws that they might have, but also good qualities as well. They had very, very strict superficial criteria of what they wanted from a man, and if there was anything that wasn't being ticked off on that list, they would discard them entirely. She also discusses what she saw often, which was this mismatch between the public feminist identity versus the private secret longing. As she says, quote, "Every one of my single friends wanted to be married, but none of us would admit how badly we craved it for fear of sounding weak or needy or, God forbid, anti-feminist." And I can completely understand where she's coming from. I mean, nowadays, if you express that you want any of these things, you're likely going to be called a pick-me, which is kind of similar to being called an anti-feminist, because whenever you're called these things, it implies that you don't like women, or you're betraying women because you're trying to appease or to pander to men. And this is something that Gottlieb actually acknowledges within her own article, as she says that aspiring for or wanting these more traditional ideals is often very much seen as betraying the feminist cause. Gottlieb describes the attitudes she saw as generational entitlement, women expecting constant passion, ideal partners, and immediate fulfillment from marriage, writing, "We don't wait to see if connection develops. If a relationship takes too much effort, we bail." With many single women acting like maximizers who held the belief that the longer you wait and the more you search, the better the guy is going to have to be. You don't want to have gone through all that struggle and turmoil only to end up with a good enough guy. But she acknowledges the problem with this mentality, as she states that often it does lead many women to leaving relationships with men who are good just because they're not quite perfect. And then in the end, what ends up happening is, because they have this belief that because they've been looking for so long that the person they have to be with has to be practically perfect or the best of the best of the best, it causes them to actually be a lot more critical of the men that they end up trying to date, because they're constantly trying to see if they are good enough, and they are more likely to focus on their faults and find that the men that they date will never truly measure up to the picture that they have inside their heads, which is why many of them would end up ultimately just being single. She also warns that indecisiveness as well as perpetual comparison can also lead to unhappiness, and also creates this fear of settling that some women have. But she does also make a clear distinction between settling and compromising, stating that she doesn't think that you should just marry an awful person just for the sake of getting married. However, it's important for you to have realistic expectations and realistic goals for what you want for yourself within your love life. What matters is finding the perfect partner, not the perfect person, having reasonable expectations. She then also encourages women to search for important core traits like shared values, kindness, and responsibility, rather than hyper-focusing on this superficial criteria checklist. I also found that Gottlieb, if I'm even pronouncing her name correctly, I really hope I am, but I'm trying, okay? I also found a really interesting interview that she did with Mary Claire, where she was talking about the problems with the feminist view of self-sufficiency. And she was talking about how she thinks that this idea of being super self-sufficient and hyper-independent is actually antithetical to a successful relationship, which requires interdependence and vulnerability. And so she very much argues that the feminist views about self-sufficiency are actually are misapplied in the context of romantic life. And for that reason, it doesn't really work. And the reason I found it really interesting is because it actually reminded me of a conversation that I had with a friend of mine. I remember in the earlier stages of her relationship where we were talking on the phone, and she was saying how she found that she had to let go of some of these feminist views that she'd had for many years, because we both went through that feministy phase in our lives, because she was very much a hyper independent girl, like very, very independent, wanted to do everything for herself. And so when she got into a relationship with her boyfriend, now husband, she was very much determined to prove to him that she could independently do things, independently problem solve, and that she didn't need him, but not in a spiteful way, just in a way of trying to show him that she wasn't a burden and she wasn't dead weight, she could hold her own. Because to her, she thought that that would be an attractive trait. She thought that that would be something that he would like. When in reality, what actually ended up happening was, she ended up just making him feel as though, why was he really in her life? Because if she didn't really need him, then what was the point of them even being together? I think that's just because of the fact that for many women, including her at the time, I don't think we really understand just how much feeling needed is quite an important thing to a lot of men. A lot of men like to feel needed or need to feel needed. It is something that is quite important to them. And it's something that I don't think she understood at the time. And so it was kind of ironic in the end, because she was being hyper independent because she thought that would be a positive trait and something that he would like, but actually it was pushing him away, because he wanted to feel needed, he wanted to help her, he wanted to take care of her, he wanted to be all of those things for her, but she wasn't allowing him to do that. And so it kind of had a negative impact on their relationship as opposed to a positive one. But thankfully she was able to have the self-awareness to kind of realize what was happening there and kind of make some adjustments. But in also doing that, she realized that she kind of had to let go of some of these feminist beliefs that she had about, you know, how to conduct yourself in a relationship, and her views about independence and all of that kind of stuff, and the position that a man should take in her life, etc. And to be fair, they're now happily married, and she is absolutely so in love with this man. She literally glows when she talks about him, and it's just crazy to me to think that if she didn't have that moment of realizing what was going on there and wasn't able to course correct, then her outcome would have probably been different. Who knows if they would have gotten married? And that's such a weird thing to even think about now, because I can't imagine them two not being married. Like, they make perfect sense together, but they could very well have not been like that, because her views before were actually causing harm to her relationship. It is crazy how much this stuff can have a big impact on your outcomes, which is why I think it's important to talk about. But within the rest of her interview with Mary Claire, Gottlieb also talks about the fact that we need to kind of destigmatize women saying that they want to have a partner. You know, she emphasizes the fact that there's nothing wrong with wanting to be in a relationship. There's nothing wrong with wanting to have a partner. But yeah, we seem to have this kind of culture where if a woman openly outright says that she wants these things, she's kind of viewed in a negative way, to the point where, like she said before in her article, that many women within her generation didn't even feel comfortable saying to each other that they longed for marriage and longed for kids and family and stuff like that. Now, Gottlieb's message did unsurprisingly receive some backlash. She had some people accusing her of being an anti-feminist and also calling her shameful, arguing that she was basically trying to encourage women to settle down with anyone and to get married out of fear. To which she responded to by saying that she's not criticizing feminism as a whole, and she's also not saying that you should just marry and settle down with anybody, but she is making a point of discussing and challenging some of the feminist ideas that are out there that encourage women to believe that they can have it all without having to compromise on anything. Because she does think that it can be harmful to some women when it comes to the impact it can have on their romantic lives. Because of course, if you're going to be in a relationship with someone, you're gonna have to compromise. So if you've got an ideology that teaches you that you should never compromise, and that's what empowerment looks like, then it makes it very difficult for you to be able to have a healthy, sustainable relationship. I also just find it really crazy that she was considered an anti-feminist for discussing this, because ultimately what she's doing is she's looking back on her life and she's reflecting on the choices that she's made that have led to the outcomes that she has. Quite clearly, she's not happy with the outcomes that she's had as a result of those choices she made in her youth. And so what she's simply doing is connecting the dots to understand how she got there, and is just simply spreading the word to other young women so that they don't repeat the mistakes that she's made. But I guess it would have been pro-feminist if she just kept quiet and just allowed women to potentially end up in the same situation that she's found herself in. I just find that really bizarre, because what are we classifying as feminist and anti-feminist these days? Because I see an older woman who's trying to help younger women by sharing wisdom, but yet somehow that's considered anti-feminist. Then the last article we'll be discussing today is by Petronella Wyatt, titled "Feminism Has Left Middle-Aged Women Like Me Single, Childless and Depressed." Within her article, Wyatt argues that feminism failed women within her generation because it taught them to prioritize their careers above all else, and in the process it's left them single and childless in their 50s. She describes growing up in a privileged background during the Thatcher era, and she remembers a time when she was in private school when Margaret Thatcher came and spoke to her when she was 13, And what she was told by Margaret Thatcher was that her career superseded any relationship she'll ever have with the opposite sex. At school, she remembers regularly being discouraged from pursuing traditional pursuits, as she would often hear things like, "Paulinas don't cook, they think." Again, Wyatt is not completely against feminism. She acknowledges the many successes and the necessary things that feminism did in the past, such as allowing women to have financial freedom, as well as also giving them the opportunity to access education and the workforce. However, she feels as though as modern Western cultures have evolved and changed, feminism also needs to evolve and change, because she does feel as though our current culture, in the way that it is now, has actually outgrown the old traditional feminist goals, and so she thinks that it's time for it to have a rethink and for it to adapt. A central part of her argument within her article is that middle-aged, single, childless women in her generation are deeply lonely. She cites a US medical study that identified loneliness as a leading cause of depression amongst middle-aged women. She also shares her own experience and how she's also struggled very much with depression, and how one time it was so bad she had to be hospitalized after some friends raised some concerns because she had impulses of very dark thoughts, and she had confided in a nurse that she had contemplated taking her own life. And she strongly links her depression to the fact that she was living a very solitary existence. And this isn't really uncommon, because I saw a documentary called The Birth Gap, and they were talking about how there's like a generation of older women in Japan who never had children, and the effects that loneliness actually has on them.
While we were filming, unknown to me, our production assistant Mie was talking to some locals. They explained how the week before, a 90-year-old woman with no family had thrown herself from the roof.
One man said, right there. She fell off because she was lonely.
Back near the station, I asked the store owner and his mother how often this happens. On a weekly basis, in this Tokyo suburb, old people were throwing themselves from the roofs, or their corpses were being found in their homes.
And so I do think we really do underestimate how difficult loneliness actually is, because we're so young. You know, when you're young, you know, your parents are still around, you still have friends who probably don't all have children yet, so their time is not really super occupied with family and obligations, etc. And, you know, you've got so many people around you, you've got your own community, so the loneliness is not really something you can comprehend when you're younger. But when you're older, that's really when I think a lot of people really feel it, and I don't think anything can really prepare you for it. Within Wyatt's article, she states, quote, "Much of my depression sprung from a solitary existence that would be eschewed by a race of alley cats. I do not know one single woman of my generation who lives such a life and actually likes it." She also discusses how her peers were taught to behave and think like men, something that she now describes as a fundamental mistake. Feminism made the error of telling us to behave and think like men. This error was a grave one. Women like myself are paying for it, like gamblers in a casino that has been fixed. She warns that the stakes for women are higher. In her view, living a single life involves more risk and higher potential loss than if one had followed a more traditional path. Ultimately, Wyatt argues for a cultural reset. She implies that feminism, or at least the dominant version that she was exposed to, needs rethinking to avoid repeating what she sees as damaging outcomes for future generations. And although she believes that it may be too late for herself and her peers, she doesn't think it's too late yet for younger women, which is the reason why she wrote this article. I do really think that this is a really interesting as well as an important conversation for the reasons I said at the beginning of this video. I think that if you are someone who wants to have a family, then it is important to consider these things and to also learn from the people who have lived a longer life than you, have tried out these theories and put them into practice, and seeing what their outcomes actually look like, so you can decide for yourself if that's something that you would be okay with. I also have a lot of respect for these women because it takes a lot to publicly admit that you were wrong and to publicly discuss your regrets. Most people don't feel comfortable doing that, and I'm sure that they must have known that they were going to receive some backlash, and some of them did receive some backlash for what they wrote in their articles. Yet I'm sure they knew that was going to happen, yet they still did it anyway, because to them it was more important to get this message out and to try and communicate this with younger women than to just carry on and, you know, save face and pretend that everything is fine when quite clearly it's not. And so I do think there is a lot of kindness in what they've chosen to do by sharing their stories. I think the reason why feminism can create these outcomes for some women is because for many women, what has driven them to feminism is a fear of losing freedom, a fear of being oppressed, controlled, trapped, devalued, whatever it may be. And these fears aren't completely irrational. If you are the physically weaker sex, a defense mechanism to protect yourself is to fear the worst from men so that you can always be prepared for it, or you can at least actively try and prevent it. But this way of thinking also requires you to constantly be on guard and constantly be playing defense, which is not very good if you're trying to be in a relationship, because you need to be able to be open to connection, vulnerability, and you need to be able to have trust. And that's the complete opposite of being on guard and defensive. And so in the end, while these coping mechanisms may be well served in other contexts, when it comes to a relationship, it actually becomes quite self-defeating. Now, I know there will be people who watch this video and have similar criticisms for me and argue that because I'm pointing out the hardships that some women face for not having families, I'm over-glamorizing marriage and family life and ignoring the challenges that can also come with that too. The fact that I even feel the need to clear this up shows how true it is that simply discussing or acknowledging that there are women who have regrets about not having a family is controversial to the point where I even feel compelled to make these caveats, but nonetheless, here we go. This video was never meant to be a generic video for all women. I don't believe that every single woman is going to be satisfied with a one-size-fits-all life structure. As I said multiple times within the video, this video is aimed at the women who do want family, they want to get married, they want to have children. If that's not you, then this clearly doesn't apply to you. But the reality is, even if a woman doesn't consider herself a feminist, these ideas are now so mainstream that many young women will hold at least one or a few of these feminist beliefs, and they could be negatively impacting their relationships without them being aware of it. Most people aren't prepared for the reality of what it takes to maintain a healthy relationship because no one really prepares you for it. So if you combine inexperience with sabotaging beliefs, it's going to be a struggle, which is why I think that these women did a massive favor for young women by sharing their stories and sharing what not to do if you don't want to share their outcomes. Married life and motherhood has its own challenges too, I'm not going to deny that. But in the same way that you can find married mothers who go on TikTok to share their struggles with marriage or struggles with motherhood, or you'll find some women who make videos talking about why they don't want to get married, don't want to have kids, or why they're glad they didn't get married or didn't have children. There are also women out there who are silently struggling with the misery that has come as a result of them not having these things. They're not happy about the fact that they're not married. They're miserable about the fact that they never got to have children. And I think that they should be allowed to also share their experiences, and we should also be allowed to talk about it. This conversation needs more balance because it's very clear which experiences are socially acceptable to share and discuss and which ones aren't. But this double standard creates a lack of nuance and leads to young women only having a one-sided view, which makes them more likely to end up like the women who wrote those articles. The reality is, every choice you make comes with trade and trade-offs, and you have to make an informed decision about which ones you'd prefer to live with. But you can't make an informed decision if there's no balance to this conversation. I also don't think it helps that often when I do see these kind of articles or stories talked about, it's often by men online, and they're usually either gloating or mocking the women because their general tone is, well, you effed around and found out. And I just don't think that approach is necessarily the most productive if you're actually trying to get women, younger women especially, to actually listen to this stuff and take it seriously. But anyways, I'm gonna wrap up this video now by asking the question, are there any views or beliefs that you ever had that you've had to let go of because you started to realize that they were actually harming your relationship? And I know today this video has been centered around feminism, but it doesn't have to be based on feminism. You know, it doesn't have to be a feminist belief. It could be any kind of belief. Maybe it could be a religious belief. Maybe it could be a cultural belief. Maybe it could be a political belief or any other type of ideological belief that you found was actually harming your relationship and you found you had to actually let go of it in order to have a healthier relationship. Also, let me know what you thought about the women who shared their stories and what you thought about the stuff that they said. I will link their articles in my description as well for anyone who wants to go and read the full versions for themselves. But yeah, it'd be really interesting to know what your thoughts are on this and what you think about this particular topic. So do let me know down below in the comments. Well, if you found this video interesting, why not like and subscribe? Thank you so very much for giving me your time today. I shall see you in my next video.